there, Ezekiel here. A certain someone has been away recently on a short holiday, I am told. I am, of course, referring to Lady Hortensia, Crawfish Dunn. Double N! She will now fill you in on the details of her exploits. Well, what a month. Although it seems an awful lot longer. I'm afraid I have been somewhat incognito, by necessity really. And as I'm sure you all know, necessity is the mother of invention. I had just finished getting my gardener to clear a couple of hectares of land on my estate. A fairly harrowing experience, because it involved cutting down quite a lot of old trees, which I always find traumatic. When I think of trees, I think of phrases like ever-expanding, life-giving, joy-yielding. They give us so much and are increasingly vital to our future well-being. But necessity said that it was a choice this coming winter between the trees or the pizarros for the fire to keep warm. Well, it almost broke me to burn the Tintorettos and the Chagalls last winter, so it had to be the trees. The gardener had barely felled the last one when serendipity stepped in to save the day. I received a telephone call from the grandson of an old acquaintance who works for a company, shall we say, whose offices used to be located in Victoria, London, in the 60s, when I used to deliver post for them, occasionally. Their new, very showy offices are now located quite close to Vauxhall Bridge. I'm afraid I cannot divulge names, as I'm sworn to secrecy. It's all been terribly exciting. Anyway, Sir Richard called and asked if I would like to go on a little holiday and deliver a package en route, as it were. To which I replied, "Don't you think I'm a little too old for that sort of thing now? I am, after all, 102, and an enema is as good as a holiday, as Granny would often say, and Granny was never wrong." "Indeed," he replied, "but you're as fit as a fiddle, and as sharp as a pin, and absolutely the perfect specimen for this particular delivery." "You little silver-tongued devil," I said. "You're a charmer, just like your grandfather's C. I bet your ink's green as well, eh?" Oh, my apologies. That was a very in reference. You will have to Google capital C and green ink to be in on that little comment. I better be careful. You just don't know who's listening. Dear, oh dear. Then he said, "We need someone who is fairly innocuous and anodyne." "Cheeky monkey," I said. "I've a good mind to tell you to forget it." No, Lady D, you misunderstand me," he said. "You will be going under the guise of the grandmother of a U.A.E. businessman. You will not be alone. We will need a little cover, just in case things get a little tricky." "Oh, where exactly am I going on this holiday?" I said, to which he replied, "Moscow." "Good Lord," I said, "isn't that rather dodgy at the moment?" "Don't worry," he said, "you're not actually going into the city. You will be visiting the duty-free, briefly, at Sheremetyevo Airport, and then within the hour, after refuelling, you will be back on your flight to the U.A.E. "Oh, well, that doesn't sound like much of a holiday," I said, to which he replied, "You will be flying Emirates, first class, and of course we will be giving you some spending money for the duty-free, he said. Ooh, I said, how much spending money? 250,000 pounds, he said. Good grief. I replied, that's an awful lot of giant Toblerones, isn't it? What exactly is in this package that you want me to deliver? Oh, it's just a small crate of wine for some Russian friends who will be in duty-free at the same time. That's an awful lot of money for a box of wine, I said. It's an exceptional vintage, he replied. And how do you know they will be in duty-free at the same time, I said. Because they're Russian, Lady D. And they're going on a long trip to Africa, so they will need lots of drink to stow on their rather lovely private jet. I couldn't argue with that. When do you ever see a sober Russian in an airport? They're as rare as chicken's teeth. Then serendipity struck again. It was though all the stars and planets aligned in my head. Well, I suppose I could, I said, but you see, my main concern about the whole thing is the environmental damage it may inflict. I'm sorry, Lady D, he said, I'm afraid you've somewhat lost me there. Well, I said, just imagine the enormous amounts of carbon that this flight will burn, all the way to the UAE, and then on to Moscow, and all the way back. It has to amount to several tons pumped into the already overheated atmosphere. How can I ever look my gardener's grandchildren in the eyes, knowing that I have contributed to the utter destruction of their future environment? Oh, don't worry, he said. Of course we will pay to offset the effects. Bullshit, I said. That's meaningless drivel, and you know it. I have a couple of hectares free on my estate that would look lovely, all planted up with trees. I will require at least 200, mainly oak, horse chestnut, silver birch and willow. I will then know for sure that the effects are indeed offset. There was a short silence, and then he said, they will be with you within 48 hours. After that, you will have exactly 7 days to plant them before we have to deliver our wine. Agreed, I said. And you know what? 2 days later, a huge lorry turned up at my front entrance, packed with an enormous selection of trees. The look on my gardener's face when he saw them. We have exactly a week to get them all planted, I said. I have to say, it was utterly exhausting. For the next 7 days, starting at 6 in the morning and often not finishing until after dark, watching that man dig all of those holes and plant tree after tree, it wore me out. I was ready for my holiday by the end of the week, by which time the poor man could barely stand. But then he is over 70. As he finished planting the very last one in the dark over in the field, I swear I heard him shout, "Now get off to Moscow!" At least I think that's what he shouted. Anyway, the day of my holiday flight arrived, and a car containing my rather dishy and very fit-looking grandson from the UAE arrived to pick me up. He didn't say a lot, but he was easy on the eye. Off we went to Heathrow, and we were ushered onto our first-class Emirates flight. It was all so smooth, I barely noticed we'd taken off. Marvellous service. Champagne and canapes and more champagne. By the time we reached the Alps, I was feeling rather squiffy. My grandson had informed me that the case of wine had gone on ahead, and we were to collect it from a source at the duty-free counter and ensure that our Russian friends picked it up. I was given a few pictures of our Russian friends. One in particular was ugly, bald, and a little fat. He looked like a pastry chef to me. Pudgy, soft hands. After a wonderful a la carte early evening meal, I decided I needed a nap. And to my utter amazement, they had a bed for me to sleep in. A bed on an aeroplane. Incredible and very comfortable. I must have slept through Dubai. And when I came to, we were only 45 minutes from Sheremetyevo Airport. As we came into land, I was feeling a little reticent, but the thought of all that lovely duty-free spenders stiffened my resolve. We were escorted into the first-class lounge there that has its own duty-free shopping area where you don't have to queue with the riff-raff. My grandson and I were perusing the watches and jewellery counters, making our way over to the drinks area, when we heard a rather raucous group of Russians purchasing what seemed to me a ludicrous amount of alcohol that they were piling up on the counter there. We made our way over towards them. As per my instructions, I was to pass a note to the lady behind the counter. She smiled at me and said, "Oh, we have the case of wine you ordered," and went to fetch it. I spotted one of the men who I identified from the photographs that my grandson had shown me on the flight. A man called Utkin, I believe, tall and vicious looking, quite obnoxious, and also the bald fat one with the pudgy fingers next to him. I think his name was Pregoshin. I forget. By now they were stacking boxes of beers and vodkas on the counter beside me. My box of wine finally arrived. It looked fairly harmless to me, and just in case you didn't know what was in it, it had a large bunch of grapes printed on the outside of the box. Idiot-proof, really. My instructions were to get a receipt for it and then leave it on the counter and go back to my flight. You may think that that was an odd thing to do, but if you know Russians like we do, they are notoriously light-fingered and never miss an opportunity to steal. The one they all called Mr. Utkin picked up the wine box, laughing, and said, "Tupoy obludok," as I walked towards the duty-free exit with my grandson. I responded with Zanitsa and waved without glancing back. I had a little break in Dubai to focus on. It was on the evening of my second night at the Burj Al Arab Hotel that I decided to catch on with the news, which of course is Al Jazeera Live, which it could be argued is as good as, or even better, than the BBC, as it caters to Arab sensibility and so doesn't spare you the gore. I love it. Almost immediately, my attention was caught by the scenes of a burning plane in a field somewhere. When I had adjusted the sound, it was reporting that that horrible man, Putin, and his henchman, the GRU, had put a bomb on this plane. Oh, it was horrible to see the video of it dropping like a stone from the sky. And then I heard the name, Utkin and Pregoshin. Oh, I thought I'd read it wrong. It was at that very moment that the full and terrible extent of the loss hit me like a sledgehammer. There were at least 10 of them on board. 10 of the finest bottles of Château-Lafite Rothschild wine lost forever to the world. It was an excellent vintage and terribly expensive. When I think of them crashing to the ground like that and smashing to pieces and then mixing with all that terrible Russian vodka, it makes my blood run cold. Such a tragic and ignominious end. It was at that very moment when the phone rang in my room and the operator said, would I take a call from Sir Richard? Oh, I thought, good heavens, the wine. How could I have known about the GRU or the bomb? I immediately set to, trying to get my explanation in first, but he wouldn't hear of it. He said I'd done a great job and made an important contribution to global events, and that he was so pleased he delivered a further 100 trees as a bonus to my estate to be planted. He said that the gardener was so overjoyed he fainted. He had one final small task for me to attend to, and how could I say no after such generosity? I was to jot down the following alphanumerical code. I have no idea what that is, and give it to my grandson, who, on his return to Heathrow, is to change the flight code on their computer so as to make it look like our flight terminated in Dubai. I jotted the code down on my bedside notepad and wished Sir Richard a good night. The next few days passed, and it was only on my last evening that I remembered the code that I'd written on the pad. Good heavens, I thought, I'd better get it, to sweet, and made my way up to my room. Imagine my horror when I realised that room service must have removed the note from my pad when they tidied the room. Oh no, I thought. Then it came to me. I fished around for a pencil in my bag and gently etched over the top of the pad. The code was quite faint, but I could just about make it out. So I copied it onto another piece of paper and later that evening gave it to my grandson so he could complete his task at Heathrow. On his return, all too soon, the holiday was over, and I was soon back on my way home. As the car that Sir Richard had very kindly sent for me pulled into my drive, I could hear reports on the radio of absolute chaos at Heathrow and airports all around the country. Apparently, 3,000 flights were cancelled in one day. 3,000! Good God, I thought. There's absolutely no hope for the future. Imagine the hideous carbon footprint of that many flights. Oh, I despair. Apparently, some fool had put the wrong information on one of their computers. I began to feel better when I was driven past the hectares of fresh saplings that my gardener had planted 2 weeks previously. They looked wonderful. I have to say, he didn't seem overly pleased to see me. As a reward for all his hard work, I presented him with a giant Toblerone that I picked up in duty-free. Again, he didn't seem overly impressed, and I got the distinct feeling that he might do something to me with it. So I quickly retired to my study. On reflection, I thought it might be a good idea to hire a younger man to help him with the planting of the newly arrived trees. This seemed to help his mood. A day or so later, as I sat watching him planting and the younger man digging the holes, I was reminded of that old Greek saying, "A society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they will never sit." Well, I felt a lovely warm feeling inside, a feeling I would have loved to convey to the thousands that spent the bank holidays stuck in airports around the world. But I suspect it would have been wasted on them. I was pondering on names for my new plantation of trees. I can't bear to call them a wood. Wood is, after all, what you're left with after you've destroyed a tree. Then, in a flash of inspiration, it came to me. I would call it Pregoshin's corpse. Did I mention I'm 102?